I didn't ask for help. I asked for 1 second. The rain didn't fall that night. It attacked, slamming against my skin like cold needles, soaking through my jacket in under 10 seconds, turning the neon lights of downtown Saigon into blurred streaks of red and gold that felt more like a warning than a view. And I remember thinking, as I stood there shaking, that if I didn't do something, anything, I was going to break right there on that sidewalk. My hands were trembling so hard, I couldn't even feel my fingers, my breath coming out uneven, shallow, like my lungs had forgotten how to work properly. And behind me, somewhere in the noise of engines and distant voices, there was something I didn't want to turn around and face, something that had chased me into the storm and cornered me in a city that didn't care if I disappeared. So I didn't think, I didn't plan, I just moved, stepping straight into the path of the first man I saw, grabbing the front of his coat before my courage could fail me, and pressing my face against his chest. Like I belonged there, like I had every right to be that close, my voice barely more than a whisper when I said it. Just hug me, just for a second. And for one terrifying heartbeat, nothing happened. He didn't react, didn't pull away, didn't even shift his weight. And I almost thought I had made a mistake so bad it couldn't be undone. But then his hand came up, slow, deliberate, and settled against my back, firm, steady, not gentle, but not rough either, like he was making a decision rather than offering comfort. And the world around us changed in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't the rain or the lights, or even the sound of traffic fading into the background. It was the silence that followed, the kind of silence that doesn't belong in a city this loud. And I felt it before I saw it, the shift in the air, the way people nearby suddenly kept their distance without knowing why, the way the space around us opened up like an invisible line had been drawn. And that's when I realized I wasn't just standing with a stranger. I was standing inside something bigger than I understood. I pulled back just enough to look up at him, my heart still racing, my thoughts catching up all at once. And the first thing I noticed wasn't his face. It was how calm he was, completely unaffected, like storms didn't touch him, like chaos didn't reach him. His dark eyes fixed on me with a focus that made my pulse spike for an entirely different reason. Not fear exactly, but something sharper, something that made it hard to breathe. He didn't ask what I was doing, didn't question why I had grabbed him out of nowhere. He just studied me, like he was trying to decide what I was worth. And I should have stepped back then, should have apologized and walked away before things got worse. But my body didn't move. My instincts caught somewhere between relief and something I couldn't name. Then I heard it, the subtle click of a car door opening, the soft shuffle of footsteps that weren't random, weren't careless, and I turned my head just slightly, just enough to see the black SUV parked at the curb, headlights cutting through the rain, and the men standing nearby, all dressed too well for this street, too still for this hour, watching us like they were waiting for a signal. My stomach dropped, the realization hitting me all at once, heavy and undeniable. And when I looked back at him, really looked this time, I saw it. The control, the authority, the quiet kind of power that didn't need to prove itself because it never had to. And suddenly the warmth of his hand on my back didn't feel like comfort anymore. It felt like a line I had crossed without permission. I took a step back, my voice catching as I tried to pull myself together. I'm sorry, I didn't mean. But he didn't let me finish, his hand tightening just enough to stop me from moving further. Not forceful, just certain, like he already knew how this was going to go. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, impossible to ignore. You asked for a second, he said, his eyes never leaving mine. And now you have my attention. And I felt it then, deeper than fear, deeper than panic. The quiet, irreversible understanding that whatever I had just stepped into wasn't going to let me walk away so easily. I should have walked away the moment he said it, should have nodded, mumbled a thank you, and disappeared into the rain like I had planned before my courage ran out. But my feet stayed exactly where they were, like the ground beneath me had shifted and locked me in place. And the worst part was not his grip or the men watching from a distance. It was the way he looked at me, calm and patient, like he already knew I would not run, like he had seen this exact moment play out 100 times before and was simply waiting for me to catch up. My heart pounded harder against my ribs as I forced myself to take another step back, gently pulling free from his hand this time. And he let me, which somehow made it worse, because it meant he was choosing not to stop me. Not that he could not, and that difference settled deep in my chest. I just needed help, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, trying to reclaim something that already felt lost, trying to make this normal, something small, something that could still end if I said the right words. But he tilted his head slightly, studying me in a way that made silence stretch longer than it should have. And then his gaze flicked past me for half a second, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for the men near the SUV to shift their posture like they had just received an unspoken instruction. I followed that glance without meaning to, and that was my mistake, because the moment I turned my head, I saw it clearly this time. The alignment, the awareness, the quiet readiness in the way. They stood, not random, not curious, but positioned, controlled, and suddenly the space behind me felt smaller, narrower, like an exit that no longer existed the way I thought it did. I swallowed hard and turned back to him, my mind racing through options that all felt equally wrong. And for a second I considered lying, pretending I had mistaken him for someone else, pretending this entire thing had been an accident I could apologize my way out of. But something about his presence made lies feel useless before they even formed. "You can let go now," I added, even though he already had, the words slipping out more as a test than a request, and his lips curved slightly, not a smile, not even close, just a subtle shift that made my pulse spike again. "You already stepped away," he said quietly, and the way he said it made it clear he was not talking about distance. And that was when the realization settled in fully, heavy and undeniable, that this was not about a hug anymore. It had never been just about a hug. The rain kept falling, relentless, washing over everything. But it felt distant now, like background noise to something much more immediate, much more personal. And I became painfully aware of how out of place I must have looked standing there in soaked clothes, hair clinging to my face, breathing too fast, while he stood untouched by it all, like the storm had chosen to avoid him entirely. "I do not want any trouble," I said, more honestly than anything else I had said so far, and for the first time, something in his expression shifted, not softer, but more focused, like I had just said something worth hearing. "Then you chose the right person to stop," he replied, and before I could respond, before I could decide whether that was reassurance or a warning, the passenger door of the black SUV opened smoothly behind him, the interior light casting a warm glow that cut through the cold rain, and he stepped aside just enough to make space, not touching me, not forcing anything, just creating a path that felt less like an invitation and more like a decision already made. I stared at the open door, my instincts screaming at me to refuse, to turn around and disappear while I still could. But another part of me, the part that remembered why I had reached for him in the first place, knew that whatever was behind me had not gone away and might be closer than I wanted to admit. I looked back at him one more time, searching for something, anything that would tell me this was safe, or at least safer, but all I found was certainty, unshakable and absolute. And in that moment I understood something I could not explain, that walking away might still be possible, but it would not be easier, and it would not be better. "Just a ride," I said, more to myself than to him, and he nodded once, like that had always been. The outcome, like this entire moment, had only been a matter of time, and as I stepped toward the car, the door closing softly behind me, I realized with a quiet, sinking certainty that I had not escaped anything at all. I had simply chosen a different kind of unknown, one that was now watching me from just a few feet away, already deciding what I meant to him. The door closed with a soft, deliberate sound that felt louder than it should have, sealing me inside a space that was too quiet, too controlled, too far removed from the chaos I had just stepped out of. And for a moment I just sat there, hands resting in my lap, trying to steady my breathing as the world outside blurred behind tinted glass, the rain still falling but no longer touching me, like I had been pulled out of reality and placed somewhere that followed different rules. The interior of the SUV was warm, almost perfectly so, the kind of temperature that felt intentional, like someone had already decided what comfort should feel like before I ever stepped inside. And that thought alone made my chest tighten, because it meant none of this was accidental, none of it was spontaneous. Everything about this man, this moment, had a level of control I was only beginning to understand. I heard the driver's door open, then close, followed by the quiet shift of weight as he settled into the seat beside me, Not rushed, not hesitant, just certain, and when the engine started, it did so smoothly, without effort, like the car itself was part of him, an extension of the same calm authority that seemed to follow him everywhere. I kept my eyes forward at first, watching the city lights stretch and distort as we began to move, the familiar streets of Saigon slipping past in streaks of color. But nothing about them felt familiar anymore. Not from inside this car, not from this distance, and I realized with a quiet unease that perspective changes everything. That the same road can feel completely different depending on who you are sitting next to. Where are we going? I asked finally, my voice quieter than I intended, but steady enough to not betray how quickly my thoughts were spiraling. And there was a pause, not long, just enough to remind me that silence was something he used deliberately, not something he fell into by accident. Somewhere you can breathe, he said, and the answer was so simple it almost sounded reasonable, almost comforting, but there was something underneath it, something that made it clear the destination had already been decided long before I asked the question. I turned my head then, just slightly, enough to look at him without fully committing to the moment, and he was exactly the same as before, composed, unreadable, his gaze fixed ahead as if nothing about this situation required his full attention. And that contrast unsettled me more than anything else, because for me, everything had changed, everything felt uncertain, while for him, this was just another decision, another movement in a sequence he understood completely. You do this often? I asked before I could stop myself, the question slipping out edged with more curiosity than accusation. And this time, there was the faintest shift, the corner of his mouth moving in a way that suggested he had heard something interesting. Not offensive, not unexpected, just noteworthy. Pick up strangers in the rain? He replied, his tone even, almost dry, and I exhaled a small breath I had not realized I was holding. The tension in my shoulders easing just slightly at the hint of something almost human in his response. No, I said, shaking my head, pushing a damp strand of hair back behind my ear. I mean situations like this, and for a moment, I thought he might ignore the question entirely, let it dissolve into the quiet like everything else I did not fully understand. But then he glanced at me, just once, and that single look carried more weight than any answer. Nothing about this is usual, he said, and the way he said it made it clear he was not referring to me, not entirely, and that realization settled deeper than I expected, because it meant this moment mattered in a way I could not yet see. The car turned smoothly onto a quieter street, the noise of the city fading into something distant, something controlled, and I became aware again of how far I had come from that sidewalk, from the version of myself who thought 1 second of comfort would be enough to fix anything, and I wondered, not for the first time, if I had misunderstood what I was really asking for when I reached out to him. I looked down at my hands, still slightly trembling, and then back up at the reflection in the window, catching a glimpse of both of us in the glass, two silhouettes sitting side by side but existing in completely different worlds. And the thought came quietly, almost like a whisper I could not ignore, that maybe I had not just stepped into his world by accident. Maybe something about me had drawn his attention in a way I could not explain. And as the car slowed in front of a building that looked less like a place and more like a statement, I felt that same certainty from earlier return, stronger this time, clearer, that whatever happened next was not going to be temporary, not going to be something I could simply walk away from when it was over, because something had already shifted. The moment I chose him, and now, as he reached for the door and the outside world waited in silence, I realized I was no longer just trying to escape what was behind me. I was stepping into something that had already begun to decide my place in it. The car came to a smooth stop, so seamless it almost felt like we had been gliding instead of driving. And for a second, I did not move, my eyes fixed on the building in front of us, trying to make sense of what I was looking at, because it did not feel like a destination. It felt like a boundary, something that separated one world from another. It was tall, quiet, almost understated in a way that made it more intimidating. Clean lines, dark glass reflecting the city lights like a mirror that did not give anything away. And I realized quickly that this was not a place people stumbled into by accident. This was a place people were allowed into, or not. The engine cut off, and the silence returned immediately, heavier this time, more final, and I felt my pulse pick up again, that same awareness creeping back in. The understanding that every step from here mattered more than the last. He stepped out first, the door opening with that same controlled ease, and for a moment I watched him through the glass. The rain still falling around him, but somehow never disrupting his presence, like the world adjusted instead of him. And when my door opened a second later from the outside, I hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before stepping out onto the pavement. The air felt cooler now, sharper, the storm still there, but quieter somehow. Like even the rain respected this place, and I wrapped my arms around myself instinctively, not from the cold, but from the sudden awareness of how exposed I felt standing there. He was already walking toward the entrance, not looking back to check if I followed, not needing to. And something about that confidence pulled me forward before I could second-guess it, my steps quickening to match his pace. Even though every instinct told me I should slow down, should think, should question what I was doing. The glass doors opened before we reached them, not automatically, not by motion, but by someone inside who had already seen us coming. And that detail alone made my stomach tighten, because it meant we were expected, not me specifically, but him, and by extension, anyone with him. Inside, everything shifted again, the noise of the storm disappearing completely, replaced by a quiet so precise it felt designed, the kind of silence that made every movement noticeable, every breath intentional, and I became aware of how loud my own footsteps sounded against the polished floor, how out of place I must have looked next to him, soaked, unsettled, trying to hold myself together in a space that demanded composure. No one stopped us, no one questioned him, but I could feel the attention, subtle, controlled, eyes that observed without staring, people who recognized him without needing introduction, and it was not admiration I sensed, it was acknowledgement, the kind that came with understanding exactly who he was and what that meant. We moved toward an elevator at the far end of the lobby, and as the doors opened, I caught my reflection again in the mirrored surface, just for a second, long enough to see the contrast clearly, me standing there, uncertain, trying to process everything at once, and him beside me, composed, unchanged, like this environment was simply an extension of himself. The doors closed softly, sealing us inside, and the movement upward was almost imperceptible, smooth and steady, but I felt it anyway, that shift, not just physically but mentally, like each floor we passed was taking me further away from anything familiar, anything safe in the way I understood it. I glanced at him, searching for something again, some sign that I still had control over what happened next, but he remained focused, calm, his presence filling the space without effort. And for the first time since I stepped into that car, I realized something that made my chest tighten in a completely different way, that he had not forced a single thing, not once. Every step I had taken had been mine, every decision had been mine, and yet somehow, I was exactly where he wanted me to be. The elevator slowed, then stopped, the doors opening, to a hallway that felt even quieter than the lobby, softer lighting, thicker air, like the outside world had been left behind completely. And he stepped forward, finally turning slightly toward me, as if acknowledging my presence in a way that mattered. And in that moment, I understood that whatever this place was, whatever role he played in it, I had already crossed into something I could not define, something that did not follow the same rules I was used to. And as I followed him down that hallway, I could not shake the feeling that the second I had asked for had stretched into something much longer, something that was only just beginning. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, quiet in a way that made every step feel deliberate, like the space itself was watching, measuring, deciding whether I belonged there. And I kept my pace just behind his, close enough not to fall behind, but far enough to feel like I still had some control over where I was going. Even though I knew that control was thinner than I wanted to admit. The lights overhead were soft, warm, casting just enough glow to guide the path without revealing too much, and I realized quickly that nothing here was accidental, not the silence, not the design, not even the distance between doors. Everything felt calculated, like this place existed to keep things contained, private, untouched by anything outside of it. He stopped in front of a door that looked no different from the others, no number, no sign, just a smooth surface that gave nothing away, and for a moment he did not reach for it. He just stood there, his presence filling the space in a way that made the air feel heavier, like this was the point where something shifted, something unspoken but understood. I slowed to a stop beside him, my heart picking up again. That same tension threading through my chest as I tried to read the moment, trying to understand what came next before it happened. But he turned his head slightly, just enough to meet my eyes for the first time since we left the elevator. And there was something different there. Not softer, not warmer, but more focused. Like I had moved from being a situation to something more specific, something he had decided to pay attention to. "You are safe here," he said. And the words were simple, direct, but they landed with more weight than I expected, because he did not say them like reassurance. He said them like fact, like something that did not need to be questioned, and I realized quickly that he was not asking me to believe him. He was telling me what my reality was going to be. I opened my mouth, unsure if I was going to thank him or challenge him, unsure if I even knew what I wanted to say, but nothing came out, because a part of me understood that whatever I said next would not change anything. Not really. He pushed the door open then, stepping inside first, and I hesitated just long enough to feel that familiar pull between instinct and reason before following him in. Crossing another line I could not quite define. The room inside was nothing like I expected, not cold, not intimidating in the way the building suggested, but calm, controlled. Almost too perfect. Large windows stretching across one wall, city lights glowing faintly through the rain, furniture arranged with a precision that made everything feel intentional, like nothing was placed without purpose. And for a second I just stood there, taking it in, trying to reconcile the space with the man who had brought me there. He moved further into the room without looking back, removing his jacket with a smooth motion and setting it aside like everything else in his world, effortless, controlled. And I became suddenly aware of how out of place I still was, my clothes damp, my hair unsettled, my presence disrupting the balance of a space that did not allow for disorder. "You can sit," he said, gesturing toward a chair near the window. And there was no pressure in his tone, no demand, just a quiet expectation, and I found myself moving toward it before I could question why, lowering myself carefully, like I was afraid to disturb something I did not understand. The silence settled again, not uncomfortable, not exactly, but filled with something unspoken, something that felt like it was waiting. And I watched him as he crossed the room, picking up a glass, pouring water with the same deliberate calm he had shown in everything else, before placing it in front of me without a word. My fingers wrapped around it slowly, the cool surface grounding in a way I did not expect, and for the first time since the street, since the rain, since that moment I reached out to him without thinking. I felt something shift inside me, not relief, not safety, but clarity, the quiet understanding that I was no longer reacting, no longer running. I was here, fully, completely, and whatever came next was not going to be about escape anymore. It was going to be about understanding why out of everyone in that city, in that moment, I had chosen him, and why he had chosen not to let me disappear. I wrapped my hands tighter around the glass, the cool surface grounding me in a way nothing else had since the rain, since the street. Since that moment, everything shifted without warning, and I realized I had not actually taken a full breath since I stepped into his world. Not a real one, not the kind that settles your chest and tells your body it is safe to slow down. I forced it then, slow and deliberate, feeling the air fill my lungs as I looked out toward the window, the city, stretched beneath us in scattered lights and distant motion. Familiar but unreachable, like something I used to belong to but no longer did. And that thought settled deeper than I expected. "You can breathe now," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet without raising it. And I almost laughed at the timing, at how close his words landed to what I had just been thinking, but I held it back, because something about him made even small reactions feel like they mattered more than they should. "That depends on where I am," I replied, my voice steadier now. Not challenging, just honest, because pretending this was normal felt impossible. And for a moment I thought he might dismiss it, let it pass like everything else I did not understand. But instead he moved closer, not invading, not crowding, just enough to shift the space between us, to make the distance feel intentional rather than accidental. "You are exactly where you need to be," he said, and again, it was not reassurance, it was certainty, and I realized that was the difference with him. He did not offer comfort. He defined reality. I looked down at the glass in my hands, the faint reflection of my own face staring back at me, still unsettled, still trying to piece together something that made sense. And I knew if I did not ask now, if I did not say something that grounded this moment in truth, I might never get the chance again. Why me? I asked, the words quieter than I intended, but impossible to take back once they were out, and the room seemed to pause around the question, like even the air was waiting for his answer. He did not respond immediately, and that silence stretched just long enough to make me question if I had crossed a line I could not see. But then he exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting toward the window before returning to me with a focus that felt sharper than before. "Because you chose me," he said, and the simplicity of it hit harder than any complicated explanation could have. Because I knew it was true. I had stepped toward him. I had closed that distance. I had made that decision without understanding what it meant, and now I was living inside the consequence of that 1 second. "I did not know who you were," I said quickly, needing to separate myself from the weight of that choice, needing to make it smaller, less intentional. But he shook his head slightly, not dismissing me, just correcting something deeper. "It does not matter," he replied, his tone calm, controlled, like this was a fact that did not need debate. "You still chose." And the way he said it made something inside me shift again, because it removed the idea of accident, of mistake, and replaced it with something else, something that felt a lot closer to responsibility. I looked away then, back toward the city, trying to steady the thoughts that were beginning to stack too quickly, because if he was right, if that moment mattered the way he said it did, then everything that followed was not random, not coincidence. It was a continuation of a choice I did not fully understand. And if I had not? I asked, the question coming out softer now, almost cautious, like I was testing the edges of something I could not see. And this time, there was a pause that felt different, heavier, like the answer mattered more than the question itself. "Then you would still be out there," he said, his voice quieter, but no less certain, and I did not need him to explain what that meant. I could feel it, the difference between where I was and where I had been. The shift from uncertainty to something else. Entirely, something controlled, something defined. I let out a slow breath, my grip on the glass loosening just slightly. And for the first time since I stepped into this room, I realized something that changed everything. Not about him, not about this place, but about me, that I was no longer just reacting to what was happening. I was part of it now, whether I understood it or not. And as I looked back at him, meeting his gaze fully for the first time without looking away, I knew that whatever came next was not going to be about escaping his world. It was going to be about understanding why I had stepped into it in the first place, and why a part of me was no longer sure I wanted to leave. I held his gaze longer than I expected to, longer than felt safe, because there was something in the way he looked at me that made looking away feel like surrender, and I was not ready to give that up yet. Not when I was still trying to understand where I stood in all of this. And for the first time since the rain, since the street, I felt something shift inside me that was not fear, not uncertainty, but something quieter, steadier, like the beginning of control returning in small, careful pieces. I set the glass down slowly on the table beside me, the faint sound grounding the moment in. Something real, something I could hold on to, and I straightened slightly in the chair, no longer shrinking into the space, no longer trying to disappear into it. "You keep saying I chose," I said, my voice more even now, more deliberate. "But you are the one who brought me here." And I watched him carefully as I spoke, searching for any reaction, any change that might tell me where that line between choice and control actually was. He did not respond immediately, and I realized again that his silence was never empty. It was always doing something, measuring, deciding, shaping the direction of the conversation without forcing it. And when he finally moved, it was subtle, a shift in posture, a slight tilt of his head that made it clear he was paying closer attention now. "I gave you a place to stand," he said, and there was something different in his tone this time, not softer, but more precise. Like he was choosing his words with intention. "You decided to stay?" And the simplicity of it made my thoughts pause, because it reframed everything again, not as something done to me, but something I had stepped into, willingly or not. I looked away for a second, processing that, letting it settle, because arguing with it felt pointless, not because he was right in every way, but because there was enough truth in it to make denial feel weak. "And if I leave now?" I asked, lifting my eyes back to his, testing the boundary more directly this time. And the question hung there between us, heavier than the ones before it, sharper, more defined. He did not move, did not step closer or further away. He just held my gaze with that same steady focus. And for a moment I thought he might not answer at all, might let the silence carry the meaning instead. But then he spoke, calm as ever. "The door is there," he said, his eyes flicking briefly toward the hallway before returning to me. "No one will stop you." And something in my chest tightened at that, not because of the answer itself, but because of how easily he gave it, how certain he was that I would not take it. I followed his glance for a second, my eyes landing on the direction of the door, and for the first time since arriving, I pictured it clearly, walking out, leaving this place, stepping back into the city, into the rain, into whatever I had been running from before all of this started. And the thought should have felt like relief. It should have felt like freedom, but it did not. It felt incomplete, like I would be walking away from something I had not fully understood yet. I looked back at him, searching again. And this time what I found was not pressure, not expectation, but certainty, quiet and unshakable, like he already knew the outcome of a decision I had not finished making. "You are very sure of yourself," I said, not accusing, just stating what had become obvious, and the faintest hint of something crossed his expression, not quite amusement, not quite acknowledgement, but close enough to feel human. "I am sure of patterns," he replied, and the way he said it made my breath catch just slightly, because it meant he was not guessing. He was recognizing something about me, about the way I moved, the choices I made, the way I ended up here. "And what pattern is that?" I asked, unable to stop the question even though I was not sure I wanted the answer. And he stepped closer then, not enough to overwhelm, just enough to shift the space again, to make the moment more focused, more direct. "You do not run when it matters," he said, his voice lower now, more certain. "You step closer." And the words hit deeper than I expected, because they were not about him. Not really. They were about me, about something I had done without thinking, something I had not even realized defined me until he said it out loud. I held his gaze, my pulse steady but stronger now, not racing, not panicked, just present. And in that moment, I understood something that changed the shape of everything that had happened so far, that this was no longer just about where I was or who he was. It was about why I had not left yet, why the door he pointed to felt farther away than the distance suggested. And as the silence settled between us again, thicker now, but not uncomfortable, I realized that for the first time since this began, I was not thinking about escape at all. I was thinking about what staying meant, and that thought alone was enough to shift everything. The silence that followed his words did not feel empty anymore. It felt intentional, like something had settled between us that neither of us needed to rush. And I stayed where I was, not moving toward the door, not stepping back either, just standing there in that narrow space between leaving and staying, realizing that for the first time since this began, I was choosing not to move at all. My fingers brushed lightly against the edge of the chair as I shifted my weight, grounding myself again, reminding myself that I was still in control of something, even if it was just the decision to remain in that moment. "You think you understand me," I said quietly, not as a challenge, not even as a denial, just a statement I needed to hear out loud, because if he was right, if there was a pattern, then that meant I was more predictable than I wanted to admit, and that thought unsettled me in a way I could not ignore. He did not step closer this time, did not close the distance the way he had before, and that restraint felt deliberate, like he was allowing me space not because he had to, but because he understood exactly how much to give. "I understand what you showed me," he replied, his voice steady, measured, and I felt that same shift again, the way he framed things, not claiming to know everything, just enough to act on, just enough to decide. I exhaled slowly, my gaze drifting for a moment back toward the window, the city lights still glowing through the rain, distant and blurred, and I realized how far away it all felt now, not in distance, but in meaning, like whatever I had been running from before had lost its shape the moment I stepped into this place. "And what if you are wrong?" I asked, turning back to him, not because I expected a different answer, but because I needed to test that certainty, to see if it ever cracked, even slightly. There was a brief pause, not hesitation, just consideration, and then he answered, just as calmly as before, "Then you will leave." And the simplicity of it struck me again. The way he never complicated things, never layered his words with anything unnecessary. And yet every answer carried more weight than it should have. I studied him. For a moment. Really studied him this time. Not just the way he moved or spoke, but the way he held himself, the quiet control, the absence of doubt. And I realized that his confidence was not built on forcing outcomes. It was built on understanding them before they happened. And that made everything about him more unsettling than any display of power ever could. "You are not trying to stop me," I said, the realization forming as I spoke it. And something in his expression shifted again, subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to tell me I was getting closer to something real. "I do not need to," he replied. And there it was again, that certainty, not arrogant, not dismissive, just absolute. And for a second, I felt the weight of it press against my chest, because it meant he believed the outcome was already decided, that my choice had already been made even if I had not fully admitted it yet. I let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, not because anything was funny, but because the situation felt too precise, too intentional to be random, and I realized that I had been looking at this the wrong way the entire time. This was not about being trapped. It was about being seen, about someone recognizing something in me that I had not fully acknowledged myself. I took a small step forward then, closing a fraction of the distance between us, not enough to change the dynamic completely, but enough to make it clear that I was no longer standing at the edge, no longer testing the door he had pointed out, and his eyes followed that movement instantly, focused, aware, like he had been waiting for it without needing to show it. "Maybe I stayed because I wanted to understand," I said, my voice quieter now, but steadier than before, and as the words left me, I realized they were true in a way I had not fully accepted until that moment. He held my gaze, that same calm intensity, and for the first time, there was something almost approving in the way he looked at me, not in a way that felt like permission, but recognition, like I had stepped into exactly what he expected. "Then you will," he said, and the certainty in his voice no longer felt like pressure. It felt like direction, like something I could follow if I chose to. And as the space between us settled into something new, something no longer defined by fear or escape, I understood that this moment was not about what I had run from. It was about what I had stepped toward, and that choice, whether I admitted it or not, was already shaping everything that came next. The shift was subtle, almost invisible, but I felt it the moment I stepped closer, like something unspoken had settled into place between us, something that no longer needed to be questioned or tested. And for the first time since the rain, I was not trying to measure the distance between staying and leaving. I was standing fully inside the decision without needing to explain it. He did not move immediately, did not react in any obvious way, but his attention sharpened, focused entirely on me, in a way that made everything else in the room feel distant, secondary, like the space itself had narrowed down to just this moment, just this choice. I drew in a slow breath, steadying myself again, not because I was afraid, but because I could feel the weight of what I was stepping into, not something forced, not something taken, but something I was actively choosing to understand. "Then start explaining," I said, my voice calm but deliberate, the words carrying more intention than anything I had said before, and for a second, I wondered if I had pushed too far, if I had crossed into something that would shift the balance again. But instead of resistance, there was something else, something closer to acknowledgement. He turned slightly, moving toward the window, his reflection catching in the glass as the city lights flickered beyond, and for a moment he did not speak, letting the silence stretch just enough to remind me that answers from him were never immediate, never careless. "There are things happening around you that you do not see yet," he said finally, his voice low, steady, like he was placing each word exactly where it needed to be. "And tonight, you walked into the center of it," and the way he said it made my chest tighten, not with fear, but with a deeper awareness, because it confirmed something I had been trying not to fully admit, that what I had been running from had not simply disappeared when I stepped into his world. It had followed me in a different form. I crossed my arms lightly, not defensive, just grounding myself as I processed what he was saying, trying to connect it to everything that had led me here, the urgency, the instinct to reach for him without thinking, the feeling that something behind me had been closing in. You are saying this was not random, I said, and he glanced back at me. Just once, enough to hold my attention completely. Nothing important is random, he replied, and that certainty again settled into the space. Firm and unshakable, like a foundation I could not see but could feel. I took a small step closer, drawn in not by pressure, but by the need to understand. Because if he was right, if this moment had meaning beyond what I could see, then walking away now would not just be leaving him. It would be leaving something unfinished, something that would not simply disappear. Then why me? I asked again, the question different this time, not about his choice, but about the situation itself, about why everything seemed to lead here, to this exact moment. And he studied me for a second longer than before, like he was deciding how much to say, how much I was ready to hear. Because you noticed, he said, and the answer caught me off guard. Not because it was complicated, but because it was not, and I felt my thoughts pause, trying to understand what he meant. Noticed what? I pressed, my voice quieter now, more focused, and he stepped closer again, closing the distance just enough to make the moment feel more direct, more intentional. What others ignore, he said, and something in my chest shifted again, deeper this time, because I knew exactly what he meant, even if I had not put it into words before. The small details, the subtle changes, the feeling that something was off before anything obvious happened, the instinct that had pushed me to act without thinking. I looked away for a second, absorbing that, letting it settle, because if he was right, then this was not just about circumstance. It was about something in me, something that had led me here just as much as anything else. So now what? I asked, lifting my gaze back to his. No hesitation this time, no distance left to close, and the question did not feel like fear anymore. It felt like readiness. He held my gaze steadily, that same calm intensity, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet finality that made everything else fall away. Now you see what you stepped into, he said, and the words did not feel like a warning. They felt like an invitation, something open-ended, something that depended entirely on what I chose. Next, and as the silence settled again, heavier but clearer than before, I realized that this was no longer about being caught in something beyond my control. It was about deciding how far I was willing to go to understand it, and that decision, just like the first one I made in the rain, was already beginning to shape everything that came after. The weight of his words did not fade when the silence returned. It settled deeper, like something had shifted into place inside my mind, something I could not ignore even if I wanted to. And I stood there for a moment without speaking, letting the realization unfold slowly, piece by piece, because rushing it felt like I would miss something important. I turned slightly toward the window again, my reflection faint against the glass, the city stretching endlessly beyond, and for the first time since this started, I did not see it as an escape. I saw it as something I had stepped away from on purpose, even if I had not fully understood why at the time. You said I walked into the center of it, I said quietly, my voice steady, more grounded than before. So show me what that means. And the words felt different coming out, not defensive, not uncertain, but intentional, like I was no longer reacting to his world. I was asking to see it. He did not answer immediately, but this time the silence felt different, not like a pause, but like a decision forming. And when he turned back toward me, there was a shift in his expression, subtle but unmistakable, like something had been confirmed. Come here, he said, not as an order, not even as a request, but as something in between, something that assumed I would move. And I did, not hesitating, not questioning, just stepping closer until I stood beside him near the window, close enough to see the details I had missed before. He reached out then, not touching me, but pointing slightly downward toward the street below, where the city moved in quiet patterns, cars passing, lights changing, people crossing, without knowing they were part of something larger. Look, he said, his voice low, steady, and I followed his gaze, focusing on the movement, trying to understand what he wanted me to see. But at first, it all looked the same, just another busy night in a city that never really stopped. What am I supposed to notice? I asked, my eyes scanning the street, searching for something different, something that stood out. And for a moment, I thought maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe there was nothing there at all. But then I slowed my focus, the way I always did when something felt off, letting my instincts take over instead of logic. And that was when I saw it. Not something obvious, not something dramatic, just a pattern, a repetition in movement that did not quite fit, a car that passed twice within the same block, a figure that lingered just a second too long before moving again. Small details that most people would ignore, but once you noticed them, you could not unsee them. My breath caught slightly as the realization settled in, because it was not random. It was coordinated in a way that felt intentional without being obvious. You see it, he said quietly, not asking, just confirming. And I nodded slowly, my eyes still fixed on the scene below, my thoughts catching up to what I was starting to understand. That is not normal, I said, more to myself than to him. And he did not correct me, did not explain further, because he did not need to. The meaning was already there, clear enough. I stepped back slightly, turning toward him again, the weight of it pressing in differently now, not fear, but awareness, sharper, more focused, and I realized that whatever I had sensed earlier, whatever had pushed me to reach for him in that moment, it had not been imagined, it had been real, just hidden beneath the surface. And this is connected to me? I asked, the question coming out steadier than I felt, because if that was true, then everything about this situation had just changed again. He held my gaze, that same calm certainty in his eyes, and this time, there was no pause before he answered. It is now, he said, and the simplicity of it landed harder than anything else, because it meant there was no separation anymore, no distance between what I had been running from and where I was now. It had followed me here, or maybe I had walked straight into it. I let out a slow breath, my mind racing but my body still, grounded in the moment in a way I had not felt before. And for the first time since this began, I was not thinking about what I had lost or what I had escaped. I was thinking about what I had uncovered, what I had stepped into willingly without understanding the full picture. And as I looked back out at the city, the patterns clearer now, impossible to ignore, I realized that this was only the beginning of something much larger than I had imagined. And that 1 second I had asked for had already turned into something that was not going to end anytime soon. The moment he said it, something inside me settled in a way that was not comfort, not relief, but clarity, sharp and undeniable, like a line had been drawn, and I had already stepped across it without realizing when it happened. I looked back down at the street again, the movement below no longer blending together the way it had before, every detail now carrying weight, every repetition standing out like a signal I could not ignore, and I felt a quiet shift in my chest, not fear, but awareness expanding into something steadier, something that felt closer to understanding. So they are watching, I said, my voice low, not asking, just acknowledging what I could now see for myself. And he did not correct me, did not add anything unnecessary, because the truth did not need explanation once it was visible. I straightened slightly, my posture changing. Without me thinking about it, my focus no longer scattered but directed, and I realized that this was what he meant earlier, not just noticing, but choosing to see, even when it changed everything. And you knew this before I did, I added, turning my head just enough to look at him, and he met my gaze without hesitation, that same calm certainty in his expression, but now it felt different, not distant, but aligned with something I was beginning to recognize. I knew you would notice, he said. And that answer landed deeper than I expected, because it was not about control, not about prediction, it was about understanding something in me that I had not fully seen until now. I let out a slow breath, my thoughts moving faster but clearer, connecting pieces that had felt separate just moments ago, and I realized that everything about this situation had been building toward this point, this awareness, this moment where I could no longer pretend it was random or accidental. Then why not? Tell me sooner, I asked, not accusing, just needing to understand the timing, the reason behind it. And for the first time since we stepped into this room, he shifted slightly, not away, but closer to the window, his gaze returning to the city below like he was measuring something beyond what I could see. Because you would not have believed me, he replied, and the simplicity of it made me pause, because he was right. If he had told me any of this on the street, in the car, even when I first stepped into this room, I would have dismissed it, questioned it, tried to rationalize it away. I folded my arms lightly, not defensive, just grounding myself again as I processed the weight of that realization, and I nodded once, slowly, because there was no point denying it. So you waited, I said, and this time, there was a faint shift in his expression, something closer to approval, like I had reached the conclusion on my own. I gave you the chance to see it yourself, he said, and that phrasing mattered. I could feel it, because it meant this was not about showing me his world. It was about letting me recognize it, step into it with my own awareness instead of being pulled into it. Blindly, I turned back toward the window again, my eyes scanning the movement below with a different kind of focus now, sharper, more intentional, and the patterns were clearer, more defined. Like once you saw them, they became impossible to ignore. And now that I see it? I asked, my voice quieter but more certain, because the question was no longer about what was happening. It was about what came next. There was a brief pause, not hesitation, just consideration, and when he spoke, his voice carried that same steady weight, but with something new beneath it, something that felt like direction. Now you decide what to do with it, he said, and I felt that shift again, deeper this time, because the responsibility was no longer external, it was mine, fully and completely. I turned to face him fully then, no distance left between the moment and my understanding of it, and I realized that everything had changed, not the situation, not the people outside, but me, the way I was seeing it, the way I was standing inside it instead of reacting to it. You think I am just going to walk away? I said, not as a question, but as a reflection of what he had implied earlier. And this time, there was no hint of doubt in his response. No, he said simply, his gaze steady, unwavering. I think you already decided you would not. And the certainty in his voice did not feel like pressure anymore. It felt like recognition, like he had seen something in me from the very beginning that I was only just now fully understanding. And as the silence settled between us again, clearer and more defined than before, I realized that he was right, not because he controlled the outcome, but because I had already stepped too far into this to pretend it did not matter. And whatever came next was not going to be about escaping what I had seen. It was going to be about what I chose to do with it. For a moment, neither of us moved, and the stillness between us no longer felt uncertain. It felt defined, like the air itself had settled around a decision that did not need to be spoken again. And I stood there with that realization pressing quietly against my chest. Not heavy, not overwhelming, but undeniable. I turned back toward the window one more time, my eyes tracing the movement below with a clarity I did not have before, the pattern sharper now, the repetition more obvious, and I realized something that shifted everything again, that what I had seen was not just a situation unfolding. It was something ongoing, something that would continue whether I stayed or left, whether I understood it or ignored it. If I walk away now, this does not stop, I said, my voice steady, more certain than before, and I did not need to look at him to know the answer. I could feel it in the way the moment held, in the way nothing about this felt temporary. No, he replied, just as calmly. As always, and that single word carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it confirmed what I already knew, that leaving would not erase what I had seen. It would only remove me from understanding it. I let out a slow breath, my shoulders relaxing slightly, not because the situation had changed, but because I was no longer trying to find a way out of it. I was trying to find a way through it. Then I stay, I said, the words coming out quieter than I expected, but more solid, more final. And for the first time since this began, I felt something close to certainty settle in my chest, not about what would happen next, but about my place in it. There was no immediate reaction from him, no visible shift, but I felt it anyway, that subtle change in the atmosphere, like something had been confirmed exactly as expected, and when I turned to face him fully, I saw it in his expression. Not approval, not surprise, but recognition, like I had stepped into a role he had already seen clearly. Then you do not stand at the edge anymore, he said, his voice low, steady, and the words felt like a line being drawn, a boundary no longer behind me, but beneath my feet. And I understood what he meant without needing him to explain it further, that this was no longer observation, no longer distance. This was involvement, choice, consequence. I nodded once, slowly, accepting that without hesitation, because denying it would have been pointless, and something inside me had already aligned with that reality. Tell me what I need to know, I said, stepping closer again, closing the last fraction of space between us, not out of instinct this time, not out of fear, but out of intention, and I could feel the difference in the way I stood, the way I held his gaze, steady, unbroken, like I was no longer trying to understand from the outside. I was ready to see it from within. He studied me for a moment, longer than before, as if measuring not just my words but the shift behind them. And when he finally spoke, his tone carried something new, something that felt less like direction and more like acknowledgement. "You already know more than most," he said, and that realization settled differently now. Not unsettling, not overwhelming, but grounding, because it meant I was not starting from nothing. I was stepping forward from something I had already begun to understand. I glanced once more toward the city, the movement below no longer distant, no longer separate, but connected in a way that felt real now, immediate, and I knew there was no going back to seeing it the way I had before. "Then show me the rest," I said, my voice quiet but unwavering. And this time, when the silence followed, it did not feel like a pause. It felt like the beginning of something that had already been set in motion the second I reached out to him in the rain. And as he turned slightly, stepping away from the window and toward the deeper part of the room, I followed without hesitation, understanding fully now that I was no longer asking for 1 second. I was stepping into something that was going to change everything that came after. He did not rush, and that was the first thing I noticed as he moved deeper into the room, not because he needed time, but because he controlled it, every step measured, every movement intentional, like nothing in his world happened without purpose, and I followed him with that same quiet awareness settling into me. No hesitation left, no instinct to stop at the threshold anymore. Just a steady understanding that whatever came next was something I had already chosen. The space beyond the main room felt different, not larger, but more private, like layers of the same world unfolding one step at a time. And I realized quickly that this was not just a place. It was a system, something structured, something designed to reveal only what was necessary when it was necessary. He stopped near a console along the wall, his hand brushing lightly against the surface before a screen came to life, soft light filling the space without breaking the calm. And I moved closer instinctively, drawn in not by curiosity alone, but by the need to understand the full picture, not just the fragments I had seen through the window. "Everything you noticed," he said, his voice low but clear, "is part of something larger." And as he spoke, the screen shifted, displaying patterns, movements, routes that mirrored what I had just seen outside. But now they were connected, structured, undeniable, and I felt that same quiet shift again. The difference between sensing something and seeing it confirmed. I stepped closer, my eyes moving across the details, recognizing the repetition, the coordination, and I realized how close I had been to missing it entirely, how easily it could have blended into the background if I had not slowed down, if I had not trusted that instinct that told me something was off. "And now you are part of it," he continued, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. And I did not flinch this time, did not question it, because I understood what he meant, that stepping into awareness meant stepping into responsibility, into consequence, into something that could not be unseen. I let out a slow breath, my gaze still fixed on the screen, my thoughts clearer than they had been all night, because everything was finally aligning. The instinct, the moment on the street, the decision to stay, it was all part of the same path whether I had recognized it or not. "Then I do not stand beside it," I said quietly, more to myself than to him. But he heard it anyway. I knew he did, because his presence shifted slightly, not closer, not further, just enough to acknowledge the change. I turned toward him fully then, meeting his gaze without hesitation, without uncertainty. And for the first time since this began, I did not feel like I was catching up to the moment. I felt like I was standing inside it, exactly where I was meant to be. I stand in it. I added, the words steady, deliberate, and they felt right in a way nothing else had before, like they belonged to this moment, to this choice. He held my gaze, that same calm intensity, but this time there was something else there, something quieter, deeper, not approval, not satisfaction, but recognition, like I had crossed the final line between observer and participant. "Then you understand," he said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything else, because it confirmed what I already felt, That this was no longer about him, no longer about what I had stepped into by accident. It was about what I had chosen to become aware of, what I had chosen to stay for. I nodded once, slowly, not because he needed the confirmation, but because I did, because I needed to feel the decision settle. Fully, completely, without doubt. The room fell quiet again, but it was not the same silence as before. It was fuller, more defined, like it held the shape of everything that had just changed, and I realized that the second I had asked for was gone, replaced by something far more permanent, something that had already begun to reshape the way I saw everything around me. I glanced once more toward the window, the city still moving below, unchanged, unaware, but I was not the same anymore. I could see it now, the layers, the patterns, the meaning beneath the surface, and as I turned back toward him, standing in a space that no longer felt unfamiliar, I understood something that settled deeper than anything else that night, that he may have ruled the world I had stepped into, but I had chosen to stay in it. And that choice, quiet and deliberate, was the one thing even he had not forced, because some decisions, once made, do not belong to power. They belong to the person who was brave enough to see them through.